Hello, everyone. I am your time-traveling navigator, Lawrence. Today, building upon our previous episode, we will take a step further back in time. Without understanding the cyclical succession and transformation of the Bourbon dynasty, it is difficult to truly grasp why France was inexorably drawn toward the Revolution of 1848. When looking back at modern French history, many are invariably struck by the passion and grandeur of the French Revolution of 1789 and moved by the rise and fall of the Napoleonic Empire. Yet, they often overlook the Restoration era, the 30-plus years spanning from 1815 to 1848. This period, seemingly turbulent and characterized by constant vacillation, was, in reality, a critical transitional phase in France's shift from a feudal monarchy to a modern society. Every dynastic change, every policy adjustment, and every act of popular resistance during these years served to accumulate the energy that would fuel the Revolution of 1848, propelling French society toward a future that was unknown, yet inevitable. Following Waterloo, the Napoleonic Empire met its definitive end. As the armies of the European anti-French coalition marched into Paris, France did not find stability. Instead, it was confronted with a restored old order. In 1814, bolstered by the support of the coalition, the Bourbon dynasty was officially restored under the leadership of Louis XVIII. This marked the first time the Bourbons had reclaimed the French political stage since being toppled by the Great Revolution of 1789. On the surface, this appeared to be a return to the Ancien regime, a resurgence of feudal aristocratic power. Aristocratic carriages once again appeared on the streets. The church reclaimed its former privileges, and the old nobility seemed intent on seizing back everything they had lost during the Revolution. In reality, however, this new Bourbon dynasty was compelled to confront a society that had been fundamentally transformed by the French Revolution, a France that could never truly return to its past. We must be clear on one point. The French Revolution of 1789 was not merely a political upheaval. It was, above all, a profound social and intellectual revolution. It utterly dismantled the feudal hierarchical system that had endured in France for a millennium. The slogan of liberty, equality, fraternity had taken deep root in the hearts and minds of the people. Consequently, even the most staunchly conservative aristocrats could no longer ignore the profound changes wrought by the revolution. Private land ownership had been firmly established, and the peasants had become the masters of the land. Leveraging their economic power, the bourgeoisie occupied an increasingly prominent position within society, while an emerging working class gradually took shape amidst the tide of industrialization. These changes, much like a seed, had taken root and sprouted on French soil, never again to be completely eradicated. Louis XVIII was acutely aware of this. He understood that a rigid adherence to reactionary policies, an attempt to fully restore the Ancien regime that existed prior to the Revolution, would inevitably provoke fierce popular resistance and could even lead to the renewed overthrow of the Bourbon dynasty. Consequently, Louis XVIII adopted a relatively moderate strategy of governance, seeking to strike a balance between the old guard and the new forces. He promulgated the renowned Charter of 1814. While this charter preserved the core of the monarchy and affirmed Louis XVIII's royal authority, it also made numerous concessions. The charter explicitly recognized equality before the law, abolished the privileges associated with the feudal hierarchical system, and retained certain revolutionary gains enacted during the Revolution, such as the outcomes of land reform and fundamental civil liberties. Furthermore, the charter established a bicameral parliament, comprising a Chamber of Deputies and a Chamber of Peers. The Chamber of Deputies was elected, and although suffrage was restricted by property qualifications, meaning only a select few among the wealthy bourgeoisie and nobility could participate, this nonetheless represented an experiment in democratic governance and a compromise in which royal power yielded to civil rights. The objective behind this series of measures by Louis XVIII was clear. Through moderate reform, he sought to appease the sentiments of both the bourgeoisie and the general populace, thereby consolidating the Bourbon dynasty's rule and ensuring social stability. During this period, France maintained a fragile stability on the surface as the old nobility, the bourgeoisie, and the emerging forces coexisted, albeit temporarily. Although the old nobility had regained certain privileges, they could no longer act with the unbridled impunity they had enjoyed prior to the Revolution. The bourgeoisie, having secured a measure of political rights and economic security, expressed, for the time being, their satisfaction with the status quo. The peasants, having retained ownership of their land, were likewise willing to uphold the existing order. As for the nascent working class, while they had yet to acquire political rights, their living conditions had nonetheless seen some improvement during the early stages of industrialization. This state of coexistence resembled a bridge built precariously on the edge of a cliff, seemingly stable, yet harboring hidden perils. For the interests and demands of the various factions were diametrically opposed. The old nobility yearned to reclaim their former absolute privileges. The bourgeoisie sought to expand their political rights and safeguard their economic interests, and the working class aspired to improve their living conditions and secure greater rights. Between these divergent demands lay irreconcilable contradictions. Louis XVIII's moderate policies could, at best, temporarily suppress these conflicts, but they were powerless to resolve them fundamentally. However, this equilibrium proved exceedingly fragile, enduring for a mere 10 years. In 1824, Louis XVIII passed away, and his younger brother, Charles X, ascended the throne. The political landscape shifted with startling speed. If Louis XVIII was a pragmatic and moderate monarch, one who understood the art of compromise, then Charles X was, by contrast, an arch-conservative and intransigent feudal ruler. He served as the standard-bearer for the most reactionary royalist factions, harboring a deep-seated animosity toward the revolution and a profound nostalgia for the Ancien regime. He remained steadfast in his conviction that the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty entailed the complete reinstatement of the old order and the recovery of every privilege the nobility had lost. Immediately upon his accession, Charles X abandoned Louis XVIII's moderate course and embarked upon a campaign of extreme reactionary measures, steering the nation step by step down a path of retrograde restoration. Charles X's reactionary policies were directed, first and foremost, toward the church and the old nobility. He reinstated all of the church's former privileges, returning all ecclesiastical properties that had been confiscated during the Revolution. He empowered the church to regain control over education, banned the dissemination of revolutionary ideals within schools, and even decreed that members of the clergy were permitted to intervene in secular affairs. Concurrently, he vigorously championed the old nobility, bestowing upon them a profusion of titles and privileges, thereby propelling them back to the very center of the political stage and entrusting them with the reins of state power. These measures inflicted severe damage upon the interests of both the bourgeoisie and the general populace, while simultaneously violating the social consensus that had taken shape in the wake of the revolution. Even more intolerable to the populace and the bourgeoisie was Charles X's politically repressive rule. He promulgated the July ordinances, openly curtailing freedom of the press, banning all speech critical of the monarchy or opposed to the Ancien regime, shutting down dozens of progressive newspapers, and arresting a great number of journalists and scholars who advocated for liberal democracy. Furthermore, he dissolved the Chamber of Deputies, an institution dominated by bourgeois representatives, because it had repeatedly opposed his reactionary policies and refused to pass the retrogressive legislation he proposed. These regressive actions by Charles X amounted to a direct repudiation of the achievements of the French Revolution and the fundamental principles established by the Charter of 1814. They thoroughly breached the social bottom line that had taken shape since the Revolution, thereby reigniting the will to resist among the various social classes that had previously reached a tentative compromise. In the France of that era, the bourgeoisie had emerged as the economic pillar of society, controlling factories, mines, and commerce. Yet, politically, they were marginalized by the old aristocracy and denied political rights commensurate with their economic power. The peasantry, though now possessing land, continued to endure arduous lives under the burden of heavy taxes and levies, fearing that Charles X's retrogressive policies would once again strip them of their land. Meanwhile, amidst the process of industrialization, the working class suffered under capitalist exploitation, enduring long hours, grueling labor, and meager wages. And with the added weight of Charles X's repressive regime, their very space for survival was further constricted. Consequently, people from diverse social strata, despite their differing interests and demands, achieved an unprecedented unity in their opposition to Charles X and his reactionary restorationist agenda. In the streets and alleyways, people buzzed with discussion. The collective discontent simmered like a volcano, poised to erupt at any moment. Ultimately, these regressive actions triggered a violent backlash. In July 1830, a massive uprising erupted in Paris, an event known to history as the July Revolution. The immediate fuse for this uprising was the July Ordinances promulgated by Charles X. This decree served to thoroughly ignite the fury of the populace. Citizens of Paris poured into the streets, weapons in hand, chanting the slogans of liberty, equality, fraternity, and engaged in fierce confrontations with the king's army. Barricades, constructed from stones, timber, and overturned carriages, reappeared throughout the city of Paris. These served not only as defensive strongholds for the resistance, but also as powerful symbols of the people's resolve. Through their actions, they demonstrated that a return to the ancien regime was no longer possible for France, and that the progress ushered in by the Great Revolution could never again be reversed. A wave of insurrection swept rapidly across Paris. The king's army suffered repeated setbacks, and an increasing number of soldiers defected to join the ranks of the insurgents. Faced with this surging tide of rebellion, Charles X attempted to compromise by revoking the July Ordinances and dissolving his cabinet. However, by this point, the populace had lost all faith in the obstinate monarch. They demanded Charles X's abdication and the complete overthrow of the Bourbon dynasty. Under immense pressure and with no other recourse, Charles X was forced to abdicate and subsequently fled to England to seek asylum. Thus, the Bourbon dynasty was overthrown for a second time. This feudal dynasty, which had ruled France for centuries, met its definitive decline amidst the waves of revolution and popular resistance, never again to reclaim its former glory. It is noteworthy, however, that the July Revolution of 1830 did not result in the establishment of a full-fledged republic. Instead, a compromise solution was adopted. Louis Philippe was proclaimed king, inaugurating what came to be known as the July Monarchy. Louis Philippe hailed from the House of Orleans, a cadet branch of the Bourbon dynasty. Having previously supported the Great Revolution, he enjoyed a certain degree of popularity among the public. Moreover, he represented the interests of the bourgeoisie, a stance fundamentally distinct from the old aristocratic forces represented by Charles X. Consequently, following the victory of the uprising, the bourgeoisie, along with segments of the general public, unanimously agreed to elevate Louis Philippe to the throne, in the hope that he would establish a regime that served bourgeois interests while simultaneously maintaining social stability. This regime came to be characterized as a bourgeois monarchy, a political order that differed from traditional forms of absolute kingship, yet fell short of truly realizing a democratic republic. Compared to the Bourbon Restoration, the royal authority under the July Monarchy was further curtailed, while the power of the legislature saw a certain expansion. However, this expansion of power was strictly confined to a select minority of the wealthy bourgeoisie. Upon ascending to the throne, Louis Philippe implemented a series of policies favorable to the bourgeoisie. He repealed the reactionary decrees of Charles X, restored freedom of the press, and broadened the scope of suffrage. Though voting rights remained subject to property qualifications, the criteria were nonetheless more relaxed than during the reign of Louis XVIII, thereby granting a greater number of bourgeois citizens the right to participate in politics. Concurrently, he vigorously fostered the growth of industry and commerce, encouraging the development of a capitalist economy and enabling the bourgeoisie to accrue even greater economic benefits. It was precisely at this juncture that problems began to accumulate. While the July Monarchy sought to avoid the extreme conservatism characteristic of the Bourbon Restoration, it veered toward a different form of imbalance. It firmly concentrated power in the hands of a wealthy elite, specifically what we term the financial bourgeoisie and the industrial magnates. Leveraging their immense economic clout, this affluent segment of the bourgeoisie monopolized the nation's political authority and economic resources. The policies they formulated were designed solely to safeguard their own interests, while completely disregarding the grievances and demands of the petty bourgeoisie, the working class, and the peasantry. In contrast to the limited inclusiveness of the Louis XVIII era or the staunch reactionism of Charles X, Louis Philippe's rule appeared far more pragmatic, yet also far more detached. He pursued neither a nostalgic return to the past nor the ideals of democracy. His sole objectives were stability and the maximization of bourgeois interests. Under the dominion of the July Monarchy, France's capitalist economy experienced rapid expansion. The Industrial Revolution surged forward, factories proliferated, urban centers expanded in scale, and the wealth of the bourgeoisie continued to accumulate. Yet, simultaneously, the gap between rich and poor widened inexorably. and social tensions intensified with each passing day. Although the petty and middle bourgeoisie possessed a certain amount of property, they found their room for growth increasingly constricted under the pressure exerted by the big bourgeoisie. They yearned for greater political rights and hoped to participate in the governance of the nation, yet they remained excluded from the power structure. The working class, meanwhile, continued to grow in numbers. Subjected to brutal exploitation in the factories, they toiled for over a dozen hours a day for wages that barely sufficed to sustain a basic existence. Lacking any labor protections, they faced utter destitution should they lose their jobs. The peasantry, though nominally possessing land, remained mired in poverty under the crushing weight of heavy taxation and rising prices, their interests left entirely unprotected. Thus, a distinct historical trajectory gradually emerged. In the early years of the Bourbon Restoration, Louis XVIII attempted to reconcile the revolution, seeking a balance between royal authority and civil rights, thereby maintaining a brief and fragile stability. Subsequently, Charles X embarked upon a path of reactionary restoration, vainly attempting to reinstate the ancien regime. This provoked a popular uprising and ultimately led to his overthrow. The July Monarchy, in turn, shifted toward bourgeois monopolization, concentrating power and wealth in the hands of a select few, thereby generating fresh social grievances and accumulating new contradictions. In other words, between 1815 and 1848, France consistently failed to resolve a fundamental question: who truly represented the nation? Was it the king, the nobility, or the people? This question, haunting the development of French society like a curse, remained unanswered despite repeated attempts. Instead of yielding a solution, each effort merely triggered fresh turmoil. When an economic crisis erupted in the 1840s, when political reform was summarily rejected, and when an increasing number of people realized they belonged neither to the old aristocracy nor to the new power establishment, revolution ceased to be merely an option. It became an inevitability. From 1845 to 1847, France suffered severe agricultural failures. Grain yields plummeted, and prices, particularly that of bread, skyrocketed, more than doubling in value. As bread constituted the staple diet of the French populace at the time, this explosive surge in its price plunged the lives of ordinary citizens into dire straits, leaving many unable to secure even the most basic sustenance. Concurrently, an industrial crisis erupted. Factory orders plummeted, businesses collapsed en masse, and workers were thrown out of work. The ranks of the unemployed swelled dramatically, and the streets became crowded with displaced, homeless laborers. Faced with this severe economic crisis, the government of the July Monarchy not only failed to implement effective measures to alleviate the plight of the populace, but instead continued to safeguard the interests of the haute bourgeoisie, slashing social welfare programs and increasing taxes, actions that further inflamed public discontent. The middle and petty bourgeoisie repeatedly pressed for political reform, demanding an expansion of suffrage, a lowering of property qualifications for voting, and the establishment of a more democratic political system. Yet, every one of these demands was rejected by the July Monarchy's government. Louis Philippe and his administration, blinded by their own vested interests, turned a blind eye to the suffering of the people and turned a deaf ear to the mounting social tensions. They believed that by merely maintaining the existing order, they could preserve their own power and privileges, unaware that a far greater storm was quietly brewing. Thus, the outbreak of 1848 was not merely an act of resistance against the July Monarchy, but rather a final reckoning with the entire era of the Restoration. From the French Revolution of 1789 to the July Revolution of 1830, and culminating in the French Revolution of February 1848, French society spent over half a century of turmoil ceaselessly attempting to answer a single question: who should rule a nation? What kind of political system should be established? These attempts met with varying degrees of success and failure, involving both compromise and resistance. Yet, each endeavor served to propel French society forward, embedding the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity ever more deeply into the hearts and minds of the people. And the answer remains in flux. History never simply repeats itself, yet it invariably leaves behind echoes. The rise and fall of the Bourbon dynasty constitutes not merely the saga of a single royal house, but a profound experiment concerning the intricate relationship between political systems, power, and the people. It teaches us that any regime attempting to defy the tide of historical progress or disregard the interests of the populace is ultimately destined to be cast aside by history. Likewise, any monarch who seeks to perpetuate their rule through repressive governance and reactionary regression will ultimately be abandoned by the people. As we shift our gaze from the recurrent succession of the Bourbon dynasty to the rule of the July Monarchy, and then cast a retrospective glance over the entirety of the first half of 19th century France, we discover that the Revolution of 1848 was, in reality, a long overdue eruption. It did not. It was not a mere accident. Rather, it represented the explosive culmination of contradictions that had long been accumulating within French society, a rebellion by people of all social strata against an unjust status quo, and an unwavering pursuit of democracy, liberty, and equality. During the latter years of Louis Philippe's reign, the fissures within society were no longer hidden, but clearly visible. The bourgeoisie itself had become fractured. The haute bourgeoisie, the wealthy elite, held the reins of power and lived lives of lavish indulgence, while the middle and lower bourgeoisie were excluded from power and struggled to advance. Meanwhile, the working class grew steadily in strength alongside the process of industrialization. Though numbering in the millions, they possessed virtually no political rights, and their living conditions were abysmal. The peasantry, despite owning land, remained mired in poverty and destitution, crushed under the dual burden of onerous taxes and rising prices. This social structure rendered the entire society akin to an unbalanced pyramid. The lower one descended, the greater the pressure became. The discontent of the masses at the bottom simmered like a volcano poised to erupt, ready to explode at any moment. More importantly, shifts in intellectual currents were quietly reshaping people's expectations. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, inherited from the French Revolution, were no longer mere slogans. They had become the standards by which people of all classes measured their reality and the ideals they strove to attain. Republicans demanded the abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of a democratic republic, seeking to place state power truly in the hands of the people. Liberals called for an expansion of suffrage and a lowering of property qualifications, aiming to enable a greater number of citizens to participate in the governance of the nation. Meanwhile, emerging socialist ideologies began to focus on the survival and dignity of the working class, advocating for improved working conditions, higher wages, and the establishment of a more equitable system of social distribution. The dissemination of these ideas served to further liberate the minds of the people, intensifying their dissatisfaction with the status quo while filling them with heightened expectations for the future. Consequently, a pivotal shift occurred. People ceased merely opposing a specific monarch and began, instead, to question the entire political system itself. They were no longer content with limited democracy and liberty, nor would they tolerate the monopolization of power and wealth by a privileged few. They aspired to establish a regime that truly belonged to the people, a system capable of safeguarding the interests of every social class. This ideological transformation laid a solid intellectual foundation for the outbreak of the Revolution of 1848. This collective sentiment found its most concentrated expression in the Banquet campaign. In 1847, France's petty bourgeoisie, intellectuals, and working class launched a political campaign known as the Banquet campaign. Through the medium of banquets, they gathered to deliver speeches, disseminate ideas of democracy and liberty, articulate demands for political reform, and call for the expansion of suffrage, the abolition of the monarchy, and the improvement of public welfare. What initially appeared to be a set of moderate reform demands gradually evolved into a broad-based political mobilization. As more and more people joined its ranks, the Banquet campaign spread from Paris to cities across France, transforming into a massive and formidable mass political movement. Faced with the surging momentum of the Banquet campaign, the government of the July Monarchy was seized by panic. Fearing that the movement would destabilize their rule, they opted for harsh repressive measures, banning banquets of any kind and arresting a large number of the campaign's leaders and participants. When the government once again chose repression rather than responding to the legitimate demands of the people, the situation lost its final buffer. The outbreak of revolution became inevitable. In February 1848, conflict finally erupted. Barricades were once again erected on the streets of Paris, and history seemed to rewind to the revolutionary years of 1789 and 1830. Yet this time, The coalition of forces across different social classes was more complex and more united. Workers, citizens, students, and even segments of the bourgeoisie, dissatisfied with the status quo, all stood together against the old order. Armed with weapons, they chanted slogans such as "Down with Louis Philippe" and "Establish the Republic" as they engaged in fierce combat with the king's troops. The streets of Paris were shrouded in the smoke of gunpowder and rattled by the sound of gunfire as the people, at the cost of their own blood and lives, defended their demands and pursued their ideals. As the situation escalated rapidly, Louis Philippe realized he had lost the support of the people and that his own army was defecting en masse. Recognizing that his reign had reached its end, he was forced to abdicate and flee to England. With this, the July Monarchy was overthrown and the French Revolution of 1848 achieved victory. Subsequently, the revolutionary masses established a provisional government, declared the abolition of the monarchy, and proclaimed the birth of the Second French Republic. In this moment, France seemed once again to embrace the ideals of revolution, stepping forward once more toward democracy, liberty, and equality. The newly established republic swiftly enacted a series of historically significant measures. It instituted universal suffrage, at least among men, thereby dismantling property qualifications as a barrier to voting rights and granting a broader segment of male citizens the right to participate in politics. It expanded civil liberties, abolished feudal privileges, and guaranteed citizens the freedoms of speech, the press, assembly, and association. It established national workshops to employ jobless workers, thereby alleviating unemployment and securing the basic livelihoods of the working class. And it implemented labor protection policies to limit working hours and improve working conditions. These initiatives marked a genuine expansion of political rights and signaled that the state had begun to confront social issues and prioritize the interests of the lower classes, a truly landmark step in French history. However, the chasm between ideals and reality soon became apparent. Different social classes held vastly divergent understandings of what the Republic entailed, and their respective demands and interests were fraught with irreconcilable contradictions. The bourgeoisie sought a republic that would uphold stability and order, safeguarding their property and interests. Fearful that the demands of the working class would jeopardize their own position, they viewed measures such as the national workshops with deep resentment, arguing that these initiatives placed an undue fiscal burden on the state and hindered the advancement of capitalism. The working class, conversely, anticipated more radical social reforms, hoping to leverage the republic to secure greater rights and improve their living conditions. They remained unsatisfied with the national workshops, regarding them merely as stopgap measures incapable of fundamentally resolving the plight of the workers. As economic pressures persisted, state finances grew increasingly strained, and policies failed to satisfy the demands of all parties. Tensions erupted once again. In June 1848, the workers of Paris launched a massive uprising, demanding a further expansion of workers' rights, the implementation of a more equitable system of social distribution, and the lifting of restrictions on the national workshops to ensure the true emancipation of the working class. Yet this time, the insurrection was met with brutal repression by the provisional government. Deploying a massive military force, the government unleashed a bloody massacre upon the insurgent workers. Thousands of workers fell in a bloodbath, and the uprising ultimately ended in defeat. The failure of the June uprising thoroughly exposed the fissures within the revolutionary movement and plunged the rule of the Second French Republic into crisis. It revealed a profound truth. Overthrowing the old regime does not necessarily mean a new order has matured. Possessing the forms of democracy does not equate to having truly realized its substance. Deep-seated class contradictions persisted within French society, and the conflicting interests of various social strata remained irreconcilable. These contradictions would ultimately sow the seeds for the demise of the Second French Republic. In the ensuing political struggles, a name gradually rose to prominence on the stage of history. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of Napoleon I. Napoleon I had once leveraged formidable military might to forge a vast empire, bringing glory and splendor to France and becoming a hero in the hearts of the French people. It was precisely by capitalizing on the public's nostalgic memories of the Napoleonic era, as well as their yearning for stability and their weariness of the prevailing chaos, that Louis Napoleon Bonaparte gradually ascended to power. A master of political camouflage, he rallied support under the banners of democracy, liberty, and stability, skillfully catering to the demands of people across all social classes. In the presidential election of 1848, buoyed by overwhelming popular support, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was successfully elected president of the Second French Republic. Upon assuming the presidency, he systematically eroded the power of the legislature while consolidating his own personal authority, inching ever closer toward autocratic rule. In 1851, he staged a coup d'état, dissolving the parliament, abrogating the constitution, and establishing a dictatorial regime. In 1852, he was formally crowned emperor, founding the Second French Empire. Once again, France had transitioned from a republic back to an imperial monarchy. Reflecting upon this period of history, one is left with a complex mix of emotions, from the Bourbon Restoration to the July Revolution, and subsequently to the French Revolution of 1848. France appeared to oscillate ceaselessly between disparate political systems, shifting from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy, then to a republic, and finally reverting to empire. As if forever searching for a definitive answer it could never quite find. We might well wonder, why did France experience such profound turmoil? Why, despite revolution after revolution, did it seem unable to ever achieve true stability and democracy? Yet, it was precisely through this process of repeated exploration that the foundations of modern politics were gradually laid. Electoral systems, constitutional frameworks, civil rights, social issues. These topics, once the subject of fierce debate, ultimately became integral components of the political landscape in France, and indeed across all of Europe. Through successive acts of resistance and struggle, the French people continuously drove the advancement of their political institutions, expanded the scope of citizens' rights, and refined their systems of social governance. Although the journey was fraught with twists, turns, and bloodshed, every step of this exploration laid a solid foundation for the democratic systems that would follow. Thus, the significance of the Revolution of 1848 lies not merely in its overthrow of a dynasty or its establishment of a republic, but more importantly, in the fundamental question it posed to the era. How can a nation strike a balance between liberty, equality, and order? How can the competing interests and demands of different social classes be reconciled? How can the state truly be made to serve the people? This was not merely a question facing France at the time. It was a question confronting the entire world, one that remains worthy of our contemplation to this very day. Dear viewers, history is never simply a matter of winners and losers. Rather, it is a long and arduous journey of exploration. Through decades of upheaval, France offered the world a profound lesson, while also leaving behind a legacy of unresolved questions. It teaches us that the realization of democracy, liberty, and equality is never an overnight achievement. It demands the tireless effort and struggle of generation after generation, a process of ceaseless exploration and experimentation, of pressing forward even in the face of setbacks and failures. If you enjoyed this historical analysis, please remember to like, subscribe, and share this video with other history enthusiasts. I am Lawrence. In our next episode, we will take you into the eye of the storm that swept across the entire continent, the European revolutions of 1848, to witness how the springtime of the peoples blossomed across Europe and why it withered away so swiftly. Until next time.